Okay, quarantine kids. This will be our last lecture on Eisenhower. It just occurred to me that some of you guys need to get in touch with me. I know my email's on the Google Classroom site, but there it is again. If you could email me directly from your personal account, that'd be better because when you're emailing me from your student accounts on the Google Classroom, I can't return emails for whatever reason. NPS seems to block that sent back to you. So shoot emails to me that way. Here's what we talked about last week. I figured last week was spring break. So I wasn't going to post anything. Haha, funny, spring break. Here's what we talked about in the last couple PowerPoints on YouTube. Eisenhower was proposing these changes to the Cold War. We were going to do a new look defense policy, right? Build up an air force, build up nuclear weapons, a much more aggressive response, and scale down on standardized military. We were going to push for brinksmanship, which was going to be this idea that we were going to push to the brink of war and then only come back. And then we had to use covert ops because the reality was we had an all or nothing approach. And so the CIA and covert operations become a big deal with Eisenhower, which gets us over to that reality, right? The new look defense policy becomes relatively useless because it's automatic nuclear war. Brinksmanship seems like that's pushing us to nuclear war. So everything seemed to be going to covert operations. And if you think back, that was Iran. If you think back, that was also Guatemala, which we talked about in some previous slides. Here's what I wanted to quick talk about today. We're going to talk about brinksmanship and China and maybe brinksmanship functioning. There's some debate whether that's true or not. And then start to look at Eisenhower shifting to a much softer approach in the second half of his presidency. So we'll look at that, and then we'll finish off with the U-2 crisis. And we'll knock those out. So here's the first of those three things: China. China, if you remember, China and the Chinese mainland under Mao is ruling here, and then there was the Chinese nationalist government in Taiwan. The Chinese communists consider Taiwan part of China. We consider Taiwan its own country of China. The Chinese government starts shelling Matsu and Quemoy, which are these two islands off the coast of China that traditionally have belonged to Taiwan. They're non-inhabitable. They're basically rocks, but Taiwan claims they're theirs. They call the United States and say, United States, step in and help us out. And the United States says, we got your back, because we can't allow for the spread of communism into rocks that are uninhabitable. But these get to some interesting questions, like how far are we going to go to defend Taiwan, which is maybe a strategic ally? Are we willing to drop nuclear weapons on them? Are we willing to unleash a new look defense policy? The president steps in to help out. Sorry, I'm jumbling around here trying to figure out what's the best way to shoot this. Here we go. The president does some interviews where he says some crazy things, which is an example of brinksmanship, right? If you look down at his quote, would you use nuclear weapons? Yeah, of course we'd use nuclear weapons. If you look at this other quote, yeah, well, we'll just have to figure out what we do here in order to do it, and you can read it yourself. What we're doing here is we're trying to convince the Chinese that we have no problem nuking them, and so that they need to back down. This is probably the best example of brinksmanship coming out of the Eisenhower administration that I can think of. And so after about a month or so, the Chinese offer to negotiate. And by August 1st, the Chinese give in and they say they won't bomb the islands anymore. Why did the Chinese give in? There's arguments that are made in, I'm forgetting the author's biography of him. Oh shoot, now I can't remember it, but whatever. He makes the argument that the Chinese were actually very respectful and feared Eisenhower. They remembered him from World War II, and they didn't want any of the heat that Eisenhower would be bringing. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. My guess would be the Chinese realized that this was dumb. They're not going to win a war. The Soviet Union probably stepped in and said, hey, calm down. We're not trying to fight World War III over these islands. Stalin's already died, so now it's Khrushchev in charge. And my gut would be that there's some pressure coming that way. But China gives in. It's an example of brinksmanship. It's not a great example of brinksmanship, but that's probably the best example coming out. Here's what I think is interesting about Eisenhower is there's this change in his mood towards Latin America starting in the second half of his presidency. Nixon goes down to Venezuela, and his presidential motorcade is attacked. In fact, he's almost pulled out of the presidential motorcade when he's there. And then meeting with the president of Venezuela, he's like, "What the hell, man? Like, why do people hate us here?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, everybody hates Yankees down here. You guys are terrible." And it's kind of the first time that I think anybody in a position of leadership has realized some of the damage that we've done during imperialism. Maybe we'll make another lecture on that just because it's kind of interesting, but it has nothing to do with IB, but nothing has anything to do with IB anymore. So maybe we'll go off on a tangent and talk about some U.S. stuff and what we did in Latin America with one of these. But Nixon comes back and tells Eisenhower what's going on, and Eisenhower starts changing his tune. Another thing happens, Eisenhower had a heart attack, and it seems like he's been much more softer as he came back from a heart attack in 56, but starts talking about economic aid, kind of a Marshall Plan for Latin America, but he can't get that through Congress. Bigger things coming through Congress, 56, 57 is going to be his big freeway bill, which is a Cold War defense project. The other big thing that's coming through in 56, 57 is that Voting Rights Act to try to give African Americans in the South some protection for voting. So helping Latin America and the Third World takes a back seat to building freeways and a feeble attempt to try to help African Americans. What else is happening? I think towards the end of his presidency, there's an attempt at a thaw. In 57, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik. Just to kind of give you a time frame, in September of this year was Little Rock, and then the next month is the Soviet Union launching things into space. So if you're president, you've dealt with a civil rights problem, and now you're dealing with the Soviet Union putting satellites into space, which means that they're going to have ICBMs, which means they're winning the space race, which is devastating. Anyways, Eisenhower's probably the right person to be in charge here because he calms everybody down, says, look, we're going to get this organized. We're going to get rockets in space. It's not a big deal. He gets one up in December of 57. He gets it off the ground, and then it crashes. And then in January, they get another rocket out into space, but you can see the weight difference. Like, our rocket's tiny compared to the Soviet Union. But for the first time, Eisenhower says, look, the armed forces aren't going to work on this all separately. We're going to develop an armed force to get us into the space. Comes up with NASA. That's coming out of the Eisenhower administration as a way to attempt to win the space race. Pretty clever. A couple years later, and here's where things start to thaw out. Khrushchev comes to visit the United States and tours the country. We try to show him why capitalism is great. He tells us why communism is better. He wants to go to Disneyland, and the United States Secret Service say, hell to the no, you can't go to Disneyland. Apparently he's pretty upset about that. But what's crazy is at the end of his visit here, he goes to the United Nations stationed in New York, claims he wants to abolish the nuclear arsenal and conventional military of Russia. He says this is stupid. And Eisenhower responds by saying, yeah, man, I'd like to do this too. And so there's this global push in late 59 to end the threat of nuclear war. And so they set up what's going to be called the Paris Peace Conference in May in 1960. And Eisenhower's actually facing a lot of people that are opposed to this on all sides. The Democrats aren't excited about this because they see this as the Republicans being able to win again in 60. The military scientists, CIA, are kind of against this. But Eisenhower sees this as kind of the big stamp that he can leave on the Cold War as he leaves his presidency in 1960. Before they go to the conference in May, the CIA convinces him to do some final spy plane missions where they're going to fly over Russia to make sure that Russia's being honest about the number of nuclear weapons they have and what they're going to do and how they're going to produce their nuclear armaments. So we fly a spy plane over. The CIA guarantees Eisenhower nothing can go wrong, and then everything goes wrong. The pilot is shot down. He doesn't take a suicide pill. The plane doesn't incinerate on impact. It is an absolute disaster. Eisenhower initially comes out to lie and says that this was a weather balloon, and eventually is forced to say it's true when Khrushchev shows the pilot on state TV in the Soviet Union. It's an absolute disaster, and it really ruins the Paris Peace Conference because the Soviet Union can walk out on this saying the United States isn't negotiating in good faith, and so that's bad. On the other hand, though, it strengthens NATO, right? France and Great Britain come to our aid saying, hey, yeah, we want to be your friends. And so there was this kind of attempt to calm the Cold War. And if anybody could have done it, it could have been Eisenhower, because, right, 5-star general, World War II hero, no one's going to question him, no one can call him soft. But the reality is the U-2 spy plane incident destroys it. The only reason I bring this up is because we always talk about the U-2 spy plane incident, and it always seems to have no context, but that's the context. It ruins a meeting. Let's be honest, we weren't going to get rid of nuclear weapons, and we weren't going to get rid of traditional armies, but we probably would have been 15 to 20 years earlier on SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, had the Paris Peace Conference gone well. It doesn't. Eisenhower, when he leaves office, says, hey, we've created a military-industrial complex. We got to be crazy about this. And that's pretty much all I want to say on Eisenhower. So what I'll do is I'll post a quick essay question. Give me 2 paragraphs on how Eisenhower is different from Truman. We'll throw it in to turnitin.com, bada boom, bada bing. Keep it pretty stress-free and easy. But yeah, 2 paragraphs will be plenty. We'll talk to you soon. Stay safe.